The dust-laden wind swept across the parched landscape of San Pedro, Texas, as Lucy Galloway pressed her hand against the small of her back, willing away the ache that had become her constant companion. The year was 1882, and the merciless summer sun had baked the earth into a cracked, unforgiving tableau that mirrored the fractured pieces of her life. Yet tonight, unlike so many others, she wasn't alone with her thoughts. Tonight she had hungry mouths to feed. Lucy wiped her brow with her apron as she stirred the pot of rabbit stew, the savory scent filling the modest kitchen of the ranch house she now called home. Through the doorway, she could see them, three children with eyes that had witnessed too much for their tender years, sitting quietly at the wooden table that Hugh Langston had built with his own hands. Those same hands that now carried a Colt revolver and wore calluses from years of working cattle on the harsh Texas range. "Almost ready," she called, her voice carrying a warmth that belied her exhaustion. 8-year-old James, the eldest of Hugh's children, sat straight-backed and solemn, his father's jawline already evident in his young face. Beside him, 6-year-old Sarah twirled her braid around her finger, her eyes never leaving the doorway through which her father would eventually appear. And little Thomas, barely 4, kicked his legs against the chair rungs, too young to fully understand why their mother was no longer with them, but old enough to feel the absence that had brought Lucy into their lives. The creak of the front door announced Hugh's arrival before his spurs jangled against the wooden floorboards. Lucy's heart quickened, as it always did when he entered a room. At 35, Hugh Langston cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and grief. His wife, Margaret, had succumbed to typhoid fever 8 months earlier, leaving him alone with 3 children and a ranch that demanded more attention than he could give. Lucy had come to San Pedro 3 months ago, answering an advertisement for a housekeeper and cook at the Langston Ranch. At 27, she had left behind her own pain in Missouri, a broken engagement, and the whispers that followed a woman considered too outspoken for proper society. Texas had offered a fresh start, though she hadn't expected to find herself caring so deeply for a broken family. Hugh hung his hat on the peg by the door and nodded to Lucy, the gesture containing a gratitude he rarely expressed in words. He moved to the washbasin, splashing water on his face and hands, scrubbing away the day's dust and toil. "Pa!" Thomas exclaimed, breaking the reverent silence that had settled over the children. Hugh managed a tired smile as he ruffled his youngest son's hair. "Been good for Miss Galloway today?" 3 heads nodded in unison, though Lucy caught the glance that passed between Hugh and James. The boy had been struggling the most with his mother's absence, often disappearing for hours to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. "Caught Johnson trying to move the boundary markers again," Hugh said to Lucy as he took his seat at the head of the table. "Man's determined to claim that water access for himself." Lucy nodded, knowing that Randall Johnson, owner of the neighboring ranch, had been pressuring Hugh to sell ever since Margaret's passing. With water becoming increasingly scarce and cattle prices fluctuating unpredictably, many smaller ranches were folding under the pressure. She lifted the heavy pot from the stove and carried it to the table, setting it down on the trivet with a soft thud. Steam rose in fragrant curls as she ladled stew into each bowl, starting with the children, then Hugh, and finally herself. She'd baked fresh bread earlier and it waited sliced in a cloth-lined basket. The children waited, their spoons poised but untouched, as Lucy settled into her chair. She smoothed her apron and cast a warm glance at the family gathered around the table. It wasn't her family, she reminded herself, even as her heart whispered otherwise. "Eat before it cools," she said, her voice gentle but firm, and with those words, a ritual as old as family itself began. Spoons clinked against bowls, bread was torn and dipped, and for a few precious moments, the worries of ranch life receded like shadows at dawn. "Miss Galloway," Sarah began, her voice small but determined, "did you put carrots in the stew?" Lucy smiled. "I did indeed." "They're good for your eyes, you know." Sarah wrinkled her nose but dutifully spooned up a chunk of carrot. "Ma used to say that too." A momentary silence fell over the table at the mention of Margaret. Hugh's knuckles whitened around his spoon, but he said nothing. Lucy met his gaze across the table. Your mother was a wise woman, Sarah, and she'd be proud of how well you're eating your vegetables. The tension eased, and conversation resumed tentative at first, then flowing more naturally as Hugh asked about the children's day and shared sanitized versions of his own. Lucy watched, a silent observer to these moments of healing, these tiny steps toward something that resembled normalcy. After dinner, while Hugh took the children out to the porch to watch the sunset, another ritual that had survived Margaret's passing, Lucy cleared the table and washed the dishes, her mind wandering to the letter she'd received that morning. Her sister in Missouri was getting married in the fall and wanted Lucy to return for the ceremony. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, sent a pang through her chest. In just 3 months, these walls had become more of a home than anywhere she'd lived before. And these people, this stoic man and his 3 resilient children, had become far more than employers. The sound of laughter drifted in from the porch, Thomas's high-pitched giggle and Hugh's deeper chuckle. Lucy dried her hands on her apron and moved to the doorway, watching as Hugh pointed out constellations to his children, his arm around Sarah while Thomas sat perched on his knee. James caught sight of her first, his expression changing from relaxed to guarded in an instant. Of all the children, he remained the most wary of Lucy, as if accepting her might somehow betray his mother's memory. "Miss Galloway," he said formally, "is it time for our lessons?" Lucy nodded. "Yes, but we can wait until the stars are finished coming out." Hugh turned, his profile silhouetted against the darkening sky. "The stars will still be there tomorrow, James. Best not to keep Miss Galloway waiting when she's kind enough to teach you after working all day." The boy's shoulders slumped slightly, but he nodded and stood. "Yes, sir." "I can read to them tonight," Lucy offered, seeing the exhaustion etched in Hugh's face. "You look like you could use some rest." Something unreadable flickered across Hugh's features, gratitude, perhaps, or vulnerability quickly masked. "Much obliged," he said finally. "I need to check the ledgers anyway." The routine of preparing the children for bed had become second nature to Lucy, supervising as they washed up, listening to their prayers, and reading from a dog-eared copy of Treasure Island that had been Margaret's final gift to James. By the time she tucked the blankets around Thomas, who always fell asleep first, the house had grown quiet save for the occasional creak of Hugh's chair in the small room he used as an office. Lucy paused outside his door on her way to her own quarters at the back of the house. The lamplight cast his shadow against the wall, head bowed, shoulders hunched over the account books that rarely balanced these days. "Hugh," she said softly, using his first name only in these private moments when the children couldn't hear the familiarity. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He looked up, the lamplight deepening the lines around his eyes. For a moment he looked like he might refuse, as he always did. Then his shoulders sagged slightly. "Johnson offered to buy the herd today, all of it, said it would save me the trouble of the drive to Fort Worth next month." Lucy stepped into the room, closing the door partway behind her. "And what did you tell him?" "That the Langston brand isn't for sale." Hugh ran a hand through his hair, streaked with premature gray at the temples. "But truth is, Lucy, if we don't get a good price in Fort Worth, we might not make it through winter." The admission cost him. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the shame that flickered across his face. Men like Hugh Langston didn't admit weakness, didn't confess fear, especially not to women who weren't their wives. "The children don't know?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. Hugh shook his head. "James suspects something's wrong, boy's too observant for his own good." Lucy hesitated, then took the chair across from him. "I have some savings, not much, but enough to help if no." His response was immediate and firm. "I won't take your money, Lucy." "It wouldn't be taking," she countered. "It would be borrowing for the children." Hugh's eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, the guard he kept so carefully in place slipped. "You've done more than enough already, more than I had any right to ask when you answered that advertisement." Lucy wanted to reach across the desk to take his hand in hers, but she knew better. Instead, she stood, smoothing her skirts. "The offer stands, and Hugh, the children are thriving. Whatever happens with the ranch, you're giving them what they need most." She left him then, retreating to her small room where she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her sister's letter in the dim light of a single candle. Missouri seemed a lifetime away now, a different Lucy in a different world. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of her bedside table. Decision made, San Pedro was home now. These people were her family, even if they didn't know it yet, and families stayed together, especially when trouble loomed on the horizon. The weeks that followed brought no relief from the relentless Texas heat or the mounting pressure on the Langston ranch. Hugh spent longer days in the saddle, returning after dark with deeper lines etched around his mouth and a growing quietness that concerned Lucy more than outright anger would have. The cattle drive to Fort Worth was approaching, and with it, the need for additional hands. Hugh had hired 3 men from town seasoned drovers who knew the trail and could be trusted not to steal cattle or supplies. But even with their wages factored in, the ranch needed a good price for the herd to survive. Lucy took on additional duties without being asked. She mended clothes until her fingers cramped, preserved fruits and vegetables from her small garden for the coming winter, and even learned to repair tack and saddles when Hugh's hands were too full with other tasks. It was during one such evening, as she worked by lamplight to patch a tear in one of James's shirts, that Hugh found her in the kitchen. "You should be resting," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot she kept warm for him. Lucy looked up, needle poised mid-stitch. "So should you. But here we are." A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he sat across from her. For a moment neither spoke, the silence comfortable in a way that had grown familiar over the months. "I've been thinking," Hugh finally said, cradling his cup between calloused hands, "about the drive to Fort Worth." Lucy set down her sewing, giving him her full attention. "What about it?" "I need to take James with me." The statement surprised her. "He's only 8, Hugh. Old enough to start learning. I was younger when my father first took me on a drive." He took a sip of coffee, his eyes meeting hers over the rim. "And truth is, I need every hand I can get." Lucy understood the unstated truth. Hugh couldn't afford to hire another man, and James, young as he was, could at least help with camp duties. But the thought of the boy on the trail, facing the dangers that came with cattle drives, made her heart constrict. "What about Sarah and Thomas?" she asked. "That's what I wanted to discuss with you." Hugh set down his cup. "Mrs. Peterson in town has offered to take them in while I'm gone. Said it would be good company for her grandchildren who are visiting." Lucy felt as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. "You're sending them away? It seems the sensible choice. I can't ask you to manage the ranch and 2 young children alone for 3 weeks. But you haven't asked." Lucy met his gaze steadily. "I'm telling you, Hugh Langston, that I am perfectly capable of caring for your children and this home while you're gone. Sarah and Thomas need stability right now, not to be passed off to a woman they barely know." Hugh's brow furrowed. "It's not about your capabilities, Lucy. It's about what's fair to ask of you. Fair has nothing to do with it." She leaned forward, her voice low but intense. "Those children have lost their mother. They're about to see their father and brother ride away for nearly a month. The least we can do is let them stay in their own home, with someone they've come to trust." Something shifted in Hugh's expression, surprise, perhaps, at her vehemence or recognition of the truth in her words. "Besides," she added, softening her tone, "I've been learning to shoot." This drew a startled laugh from him. "You've what?" "James has been teaching me. With that old rifle you keep by the back door." Lucy couldn't help smiling at his astonishment. "I'm quite good, actually. Hit a can at 30 paces yesterday." Hugh shook his head, but there was admiration in his eyes. "You're full of surprises, Lucy Galloway, so I've been told." She picked up her sewing again, the tension eased. "The children stay here, Hugh, where they belong." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But I'm leaving Rusty behind as well." Rusty was Hugh's oldest and most trusted ranch hand, a grizzled man in his 60s who'd been with the Langston family since before Hugh was born. "He'll check in daily," Hugh continued, "and if there's any trouble, any at all, you send for help in town." "Agreed." Lucy tied off her thread and snipped it with small scissors. "And Hugh, the children and I will be here waiting when you return, successfully, I have no doubt." He stood, and for a breathtaking moment she thought he might reach for her hand. Instead, he simply nodded, a wealth of unspoken gratitude in the gesture. "Good night, Lucy." "Good night, Hugh." She watched him go, then turned her attention back to the pile of mending, aware that her heart was beating faster than the simple exchange warranted. Over these months, she'd become adept at burying her growing feelings for Hugh Langston, feelings that were as inappropriate as they were undeniable. He was her employer, still grieving his wife. The children were just beginning to accept Lucy's presence in their lives. Complications were the last thing any of them needed. And yet, as she extinguished the lamp and made her way to her room, Lucy couldn't help but wonder what might happen when Hugh returned from Fort Worth, if the drive was successful, if the ranch survived, if the future held something more than an employer-employee relationship for them. Hope was a dangerous thing, she reminded herself as she prepared for bed, but sometimes it was all a person had to hold on to. The morning of the cattle drive's departure dawned clear and cool, a merciful break from the heat. Lucy rose before sunrise to prepare a hearty breakfast: biscuits, gravy, eggs, and bacon, knowing that Hugh and James would need sustenance for the long day ahead. She found Hugh in the barn, checking saddles and packs one final time. In the gray pre-dawn light, with his hat pulled low and his shoulders squared against the weight of responsibility, he looked every inch the man she'd come to admire. "The coffee's hot," she said by way of greeting. Hugh turned, and the smile he offered was warmer than any he'd given her before. "You're up early. Couldn't let you leave without a proper breakfast." She stepped closer, handing him a steaming cup she'd brought from the house. "James is already dressed and ready. Been up for an hour, I think." Hugh accepted the cup, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. Boys excited. Scared too, though he'd never admit it. "Like his father that way," Lucy observed, and was rewarded with another smile, this one tinged with self-awareness. "The men will be here soon," Hugh said. "We aim to get the herd moving while it's still cool." Lucy nodded, suddenly aware of the looming separation. 3 weeks was a long time, the longest they would have been apart since she'd come to San Pedro. "I packed food for the first 2 days," she said, filling the silence that had fallen between them. "And there's medicine in the small leather pouch, just in case, always thinking ahead." Hugh's voice held approval. "Lucy, I want to thank you for everything you've done for us, for the children." She waved away his gratitude. "It's why you hired me." "No," his voice grew serious. "What you've given this family goes far beyond what any employer could ask. You've brought life back into this house, into these children." He paused, then added quietly, "Into me." Lucy felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Hugh, I'm not good with words," he interrupted. "Never have been. But I want you to know that whatever happens in Fort Worth, whether we get a good price for the cattle or not, I'm grateful you're here. And I hope you'll stay, regardless of what the future holds for this ranch." It was the closest they'd come to acknowledging the connection that had grown between them, tenuous and unspoken, but undeniably real. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. The sound of approaching horses cut off any further conversation. The drovers had arrived, and with them, the reality of the day's departure. Breakfast was a mixture of excitement and anxiety. James could barely sit still, alternating between wolfing down his food and jumping up to check that he hadn't forgotten anything. Sarah was quieter than usual, pushing her eggs around her plate while Thomas asked for the 5th time why he couldn't go too. "Next time, little man," Hugh assured him, tousling his hair, "when you're bigger like James." "But I am big," Thomas protested, sitting up as straight as his small frame would allow. Hugh exchanged a glance with Lucy over the boy's head. "Indeed you are, and that's why I need you here to help Miss Galloway and look after your sister." This responsibility seemed to satisfy Thomas, who nodded solemnly and applied himself to his breakfast with renewed vigor. All too soon, it was time. The men were mounted, the cattle already beginning to move under the guidance of the lead drovers. Hugh knelt before Sarah and Thomas on the porch, holding them close for a long moment before standing to face Lucy. 3 weeks, he said. "Sooner if the market's good." Lucy nodded, conscious of the children watching. "We'll be fine, be safe, Hugh." He hesitated, then reached out to squeeze her hand briefly. "Take care of them and yourself." James approached last, already astride his pony, pride and nervousness warring on his young face. "Goodbye, Miss Galloway," he said formally. Lucy smiled up at him. "Goodbye, James. Mind your father and come back with plenty of stories to tell." The boy nodded, then surprised her by adding, "I'll bring you something from Fort Worth. A present." Before she could respond, he had wheeled his pony around to follow Hugh, who had mounted his own horse and was already moving toward the herd. Lucy stood with Sarah and Thomas on either side of her, waving until the dust cloud that followed the cattle had faded into the horizon. "Well," she said finally, squeezing the children's shoulders. "Who wants to help me feed the chickens?" Thomas's hand shot up, eager as always, while Sarah nodded more reluctantly. Lucy understood the girl was at an age where the absence of her mother was most keenly felt, and now her father and brother were gone too. It would be a difficult few weeks for her. "And after that," Lucy continued, leading them back toward the house, "I thought we might bake a pie. Your father mentioned that blackberries are ripe along the creek." This perked Sarah's interest. "Can we put sugar on top, the way Ma used to?" "Absolutely," Lucy agreed, relieved to see a spark of enthusiasm in the girl's eyes. The first week passed in a blur of routine chores and small adventures designed to keep the children's minds off their father's absence. Lucy took them berry picking, taught Sarah to embroider handkerchiefs, and let Thomas help her knead bread dough, despite the flour that inevitably covered every surface as a result. Rusty checked in daily, as promised, bringing news from neighboring ranches and reports on the weather to the north, which might affect the cattle drive. His weathered face softened when he spoke to the children, and he often brought small treasures, a uniquely shaped rock for Thomas, wildflowers for Sarah that made Lucy appreciate the old cowboy's gentle heart. It was during the second week that trouble arrived in the form of Randall Johnson. Lucy was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, the children playing nearby, when the sound of approaching hooves drew her attention. Johnson rode up with two of his men, his expression unreadable beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Miss Galloway," he called, dismounting with a fluid grace that belied his 50 years. "Fine day for laundry." Lucy wiped her hands on her apron, conscious of Sarah and Thomas watching wide-eyed from the porch steps. "Mr. Johnson, what brings you to the Langston ranch?" Johnson removed his hat, revealing silver-streaked dark hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Neighborly visit, madam. Heard Langston took off for Fort Worth with most of his hands. Thought I'd check that everything was in order." The implied threat wasn't lost on Lucy. "Very considerate, but as you can see, we're managing just fine." Johnson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed, though it's a shame Langston had to take the drive himself, times being what they are, selling locally would have been the prudent choice." "Mr. Langston makes his own business decisions," Lucy replied evenly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to finish before sundown." Johnson replaced his hat but made no move to remount his horse. "Work that might be unnecessary, Miss Galloway, if you were to advise Langston wisely upon his return. Meaning that my offer to buy this ranch stands, at a fair price, fair enough to settle his debts and give him a fresh start elsewhere, perhaps somewhere more manageable for a widower with 3 young children." Lucy felt a chill despite the warm day. "Mr. Langston has no interest in selling, he's made that quite clear." "Circumstances change," Johnson said with a shrug. "Especially when a man faces ruin. You seem sensible, Miss Galloway. Surely you can see that this land would be better served as part of the Johnson Ranch. We have the men, the resources to make it profitable." "This conversation is over, Mr. Johnson." Lucy moved toward the porch, placing herself between the rancher and the children. "I'll tell Mr. Langston you called." Something darkened in Johnson's expression, anger, quickly masked by a thin veneer of civility. "You do that, and remind him that some offers don't stay open indefinitely." With that, he signaled to his men and they mounted up. As they rode away, Lucy heard one of them laugh, a sound that raised the hairs on the back of her neck. "Miss Lucy," Sarah's small voice pulled her attention back to the porch. "Is that man going to take our home?" Lucy crouched down to the child's level, forcing confidence into her voice. "No, sweetheart, no one is taking your home. Your father would never allow it, and neither would I." But as she resumed her laundry duties, Lucy couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that Johnson's visit had instilled. The man was powerful, with connections throughout the county. And Hugh's financial situation was more precarious than the children knew. That night, after Sarah and Thomas were asleep, Lucy sat at Hugh's desk, reviewing the ledgers he'd left behind. The figures confirmed what she already knew. Without a successful sale in Fort Worth, the Langston Ranch would struggle to make it through winter. Johnson's offer, unwelcome as it was, represented a lifeline that a practical man might feel compelled to grasp. A noise from outside startled her, the sound of breaking glass, followed by Rusty's voice calling a warning. Lucy moved quickly to the rifle by the back door, checking that it was loaded before stepping onto the porch. The barn was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the wooden structure. Rusty was already there, working to free the horses from their stalls. Lucy ran to help, covering her mouth against the smoke as she entered the burning building. "Get back to the house," Rusty shouted, coughing as he led two panicked horses out through the wide doors. "The children are asleep," Lucy called back, moving toward the last occupied stall where Sarah's pony was whinnying in terror. "I can't leave them." Together, they managed to save all the animals, though one of the draft horses had suffered burns along its flank. By the time the last ember died, the barn was a charred skeleton against the night sky, and dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. "Johnson," Rusty spat as they surveyed the damage. "Has to be no lightning tonight, and that fire didn't start itself." Lucy nodded grimly. "He was here yesterday, making another offer for the ranch." Rusty's weathered face hardened. "Man's been pushing boundaries ever since Mr. Hugh inherited this place. But this," he gestured toward the ruined barn, "this is a declaration of war. What do we do?" Lucy asked, acutely aware of her responsibility to protect the ranch and the children until Hugh's return. Rusty considered for a moment. "We stay vigilant, keep the rifle loaded, and I'll stay in the bunkhouse instead of my cabin closer to the main house that way." Lucy agreed, though anxiety gnawed at her as she returned to check on the children, who mercifully had slept through the commotion. Johnson wouldn't stop at burning a barn, she was certain. The question was how far he would go to force Hugh's hand and what else might happen before the cattle drive returned. The answer came 3 days later, when Lucy awoke to find the creek that served as the ranch's primary water source had slowed to a trickle. Rusty rode upstream and returned with grim news. Johnson's men had constructed a dam on his property, diverting most of the water away from the Langston Ranch. "It's legal, technically," Rusty explained as they stood by the diminished creek. "Water rights are tricky in these parts. But it's a low blow, especially with the herd gone and no way to move the remaining cattle to a different water source." Lucy stared at the mud beginning to form along the creek bed. Without water, the garden would die within days. The remaining cattle and horses would suffer, possibly die if the situation persisted. And the household itself would face difficulties. They had the well for drinking water, but it was barely sufficient for daily needs. "When is Hugh due back?" she asked. Rusty squinted at the horizon. 4, maybe 5 days if they made good time. Could be longer if they had trouble on the trail. Too long, Lucy thought. By then, the damage would be done. Johnson would have made his point that the Langston Ranch couldn't survive without his goodwill, and that Hugh's refusal to sell would only bring more hardship to his family. "I'm going to speak with him," she decided. Rusty's eyes widened. "Johnson, Miss Lucy, that ain't wise. Man's dangerous when crossed." "I'm not going to cross him," Lucy replied, already formulating her approach. "I'm going to reason with him, appeal to whatever decency he might have left. And if he doesn't have any," Rusty challenged. Lucy met his gaze steadily. "Then I'll appeal to his self-interest. But I won't sit by and watch this ranch wither while Hugh is away trying to save it." Despite Rusty's protests, Lucy rode to the Johnson Ranch the following morning. She dressed carefully in her best skirt and blouse, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. If she was to be taken seriously as an emissary for the Langston family, she needed to present herself with dignity and authority. The Johnson Ranch house was significantly larger than Hugh's modest home, a 2-story structure with a wide veranda and glass windows imported from back east. Wealth was evident in every detail, from the manicured grounds to the quality of the horses in the corral. A house servant admitted her and led her to Johnson's study, where the rancher sat behind a massive desk, surprise evident on his face at her arrival. "Miss Galloway," he said, rising from his chair, "this is unexpected." Lucy remained standing, declining his gesture toward a chair. "Mr. Johnson, I've come about the creek." Johnson's expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained cordial. "Ah, yes, natural drought conditions, I'm afraid, affecting us all in these parts." "The dam your men constructed is hardly natural," Lucy countered. "And you know as well as I do that diverting that water endangers the Langston property and livestock." Johnson studied her for a moment, then moved to a sideboard where he poured himself a small measure of whiskey. "Would you care for refreshment, Miss Galloway? Water, perhaps?" The irony of the offer wasn't lost on either of them. "I would care for you to restore the creek's natural flow," Lucy said evenly, "before irreparable damage is done." Johnson sipped his drink, watching her over the rim of his glass. "Damage can be avoided quite simply, my dear. Convince Langston to accept my offer when he returns. The price is fair, more than fair, given the circumstances. The circumstances being that you're deliberately creating hardship to force his hand." Lucy fought to keep her voice steady. "That's not business, Mr. Johnson, it's extortion." A flash of anger crossed Johnson's face. "Careful, Miss Galloway, you're a long way from home and your position at the Langston ranch is precarious at best. When Langston returns, if he returns with enough money to salvage his situation, he'll see reason. Water or no water." The implied threat, both to the cattle drive's success and to Lucy's own safety, hung in the air between them. "Mr. Johnson," Lucy said, changing tactics, "you have a reputation as a shrewd businessman. What would people in San Pedro think if they knew you were resorting to sabotage to acquire land? Would the banks be as willing to extend credit? Would your standing in the community survive such revelations?" Johnson's jaw tightened. "Are you threatening me, Miss Galloway?" "I'm appealing to your self-interest," she replied calmly. "Restore the water flow and I'll say nothing of the barn fire or this conversation. Continue as you are, and I'll be forced to make these matters public, starting with Sheriff Donnelly, who I believe dines regularly with Judge Patterson." For a long moment, Johnson was silent, calculating. Then he set down his glass with deliberate care. "The dam will be removed by nightfall, but tell Langston my offer stands and it's the only protection his family has in these parts." Lucy nodded, relief washing through her even as she maintained her composure. "Good day, Mr. Johnson." She left with her head high, though her knees threatened to buckle once she was safely mounted on her horse. The confrontation had drained her more than she'd anticipated, but the victory, temporary though it might be, gave her strength for the ride back to the Langston ranch. Rusty met her at the property line, his weathered face creased with worry. "Thought you might need an escort home," he explained, falling in beside her. Lucy smiled gratefully. "The water should be restored by evening." Johnson agreed to remove the dam. Rusty's eyebrows shot up. "Just like that, what you say to the old snake?" "I appealed to his reputation," Lucy replied, unwilling to detail the full extent of her gamble, "and reminded him that actions have consequences, even for men as powerful as Randall Johnson." Rusty shook his head in admiration. "Mr. Hugh chose well when he hired you, Miss Lucy." Not many would stand up to Johnson that way. The compliment warmed her, though it also reminded her of the reality of her position. She wasn't Hugh's wife with authority to act on his behalf. She was his housekeeper, albeit one who had taken on responsibilities far beyond her initial role. When Hugh returned, decisions about the ranch's future, including Johnson's offer, would rest with him alone. The thought sobered her as they rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. Lucy had fought for Hugh's ranch as if it were her own, risked confrontation with a dangerous man to protect his interests. But what if Hugh decided that Johnson's offer was, indeed, the sensible choice? What if the cattle drive hadn't yielded enough profit to justify continuing the struggle? And most unsettling of all, what would become of her place in this family if Hugh chose to sell and move away, true to Johnson's word? The creek's flow was restored by sunset. Lucy stood on its bank with Sarah and Thomas, watching as the water level gradually rose, bringing life back to the parched soil along its edges. "Is the bad man going to leave us alone now?" Thomas asked, his small hand clutching hers. Lucy hesitated, unwilling to lie. "Mr. Johnson made a poor choice," she said carefully, "but he's fixed his mistake, and that's what matters for now." Sarah, more perceptive at 6 than most adults gave her credit for, looked up at Lucy with worried eyes. "But he still wants our ranch, doesn't he?" "That's why he made the fire in the barn." Lucy crouched down to the children's level, one arm around each of them. "Listen to me, both of you. Your father loves this ranch, and he loves you more than anything in the world. He's working very hard to make sure you keep your home. And while he's away, I promise I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. Will you stay with us forever?" Thomas asked, his innocent question piercing Lucy's heart. She faltered, uncertain how to answer. "You should marry Pa," Sarah said with the straightforward logic of a child. "Then you'd be our ma and you'd stay forever." Lucy felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Sarah, that's not. Your father and I are." She took a deep breath. "Your father is my employer and he still loves your mother very much. But Ma's in heaven," Thomas pointed out. "She can't come back. And Pa smiles when you're around. He didn't smile for a long time after Ma went away." Out of the mouths of babes, Lucy thought, her heart constricting. "It's more complicated than that, sweetheart. Now, who's hungry? I thought we might have flapjacks for supper tonight." The distraction worked, at least for Thomas, who cheered at the prospect of breakfast food for dinner. But Sarah's thoughtful gaze lingered on Lucy, seeing more than a 6-year-old should. That night, long after the children were asleep, Lucy sat on the porch swing, watching stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. The same stars, she thought, that Hugh and James would be seeing from their camp somewhere between San Pedro and Fort Worth. "Miss Lucy." Rusty's voice startled her from her reverie. The old cowboy approached from the bunkhouse, rifle in hand for his nightly patrol. "Everything all right, Rusty?" she asked, making room for him on the swing. He settled beside her with a sigh that spoke of aging joints and long days. "Just checking in before I make my rounds. Wanted to tell you that Miller rode by earlier with news the Langston herd was spotted near Jackson Creek, making good time by all accounts." Relief flooded through Lucy. "So they'll be home soon. 3 days, I reckon, maybe 4. Rusty studied her in the dim light from the window. "You've done right by them, Miss Lucy, by Mr. Hugh and those children. Ranch, too." Lucy smiled, touched by the old man's approval. "I care for them," she said simply. Rusty nodded, figured as much. "And if you don't mind an old man speaking plain, Mr. Hugh cares for you too. More than he lets on, I suspect." The statement hung in the air between them, neither confirmation nor denial passing Lucy's lips, but Rusty seemed to read her thoughts nonetheless. "Margaret was a fine woman," he continued. "Good mother, devoted wife. Her passing left a hole in this family that nobody thought could be filled. But you, Miss Lucy, you've brought something different, something they needed just as much." "What's that?" Lucy asked softly. Rusty stood, adjusting his hat. "Hope, Miss Lucy. You've given them hope that life goes on, that happiness is still possible. Don't underestimate the value of that gift." He tipped his hat and moved off into the darkness, leaving Lucy to contemplate his words as the swing creaked gently beneath her. Hope was indeed a powerful force. It had sustained her through her own difficult times, had led her to answer an advertisement for a position in a remote Texas ranch. And now, it whispered possibilities that she scarcely dared acknowledge of a future here, not as an employee but as something more. The last days of waiting passed in a blur of activity. Lucy threw herself into preparations for Hugh and James's return, cleaning the house until it gleamed, baking bread and pies, ensuring that every shirt was washed and pressed, every boot polished. The children caught her excitement, helping with chores without complaint and spending long hours watching the road for the first sign of riders. It was Thomas who spotted them first. "They're coming," he shouted from his lookout post on the corral fence. "Pa and James are coming home." Lucy's heart leapt as she hurried from the kitchen, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. Sarah was already running toward the approaching riders, her braids flying behind her. Lucy lifted Thomas from the fence and set him down, watching as he raced after his sister. And then she saw them, Hugh and James, dusty and trail-worn but unmistakably triumphant as they rode side by side, leading their horses at a walk to accommodate the children who now danced around them. Behind them came the drovers, equally weary but with the satisfied air of men who had completed a difficult job successfully. Lucy remained by the house, suddenly unsure of her place in this reunion. But Hugh's eyes found hers across the yard, and the smile that lit his face dispelled her uncertainty. He dismounted in one fluid motion and swung James down after him, before making his way toward her with long strides, the children chattering excitedly at his heels. "Lucy," he said simply when he reached her, and something in his voice, a warmth, a familiarity that hadn't been there before, made her breath catch. "Welcome home," she replied, unconsciously smoothing her apron. "You both look tired." Hugh laughed, the sound freer than she'd ever heard from him. "Tired but victorious. The market was stronger than I dared hope. We got top dollar for the herd." Relief washed over Lucy. "So the ranch is secure, at least for now." Hugh's expression grew serious. "Rusty told me what happened while I was gone, the barn, the creek, Johnson." Lucy felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I hope I didn't overstep," Hugh interrupted. "Lucy, you saved this ranch, saved my children from God knows what Johnson might have done next." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You owe me nothing," she insisted. "I did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," Hugh countered softly. "You." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities, until James tugged at his father's sleeve. "Pa, can I show Miss Galloway what we brought her, please?" Hugh smiled down at his son. "Of course, though I think we should all clean up first. Trail dust isn't a proper gift wrapping." Lucy found herself laughing, the tension broken. "Supper will be ready in an hour. There's hot water for washing up and fresh clothes laid out for both of you." As Hugh shepherded the excited children toward the house, he paused beside Lucy. "We have much to talk about," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Later, when the children are asleep." She nodded, aware that the conversation ahead would likely change everything for better or worse. But for now, there was a homecoming to celebrate, hungry men to feed, and children's excited stories to hear. Supper that evening was a lively affair. The drovers had been invited to stay and enjoy a proper meal before continuing to their own homes, and the table was crowded with hungry, appreciative men who praised Lucy's cooking as if it were the finest cuisine in Texas. James, seated proudly beside his father, recounted the cattle drive's adventures with dramatic flair, the river crossing that had nearly gone wrong, the night the herd had been spooked by wolves, the bustling cattle pens of Fort Worth where buyers had competed for the Langston herd. "And Pa let me help with the counting," James concluded, his chest puffed with importance. "Every single cow, right, Pa?" Hugh nodded, his eyes warm with pride. "Couldn't have done it without you, son." Sarah and Thomas hung on every word, their own experiences during the separation seeming pale by comparison. But Lucy made sure to highlight their contributions too, how Sarah had helped preserve vegetables from the garden, how Thomas had bravely assisted with feeding the chickens even after one pecked his finger. As plates were emptied and conversation began to wane, Lucy brought out the apple pie she'd baked that morning. The sight was greeted with appreciative murmurs from the men and cheers from the children. "Miss Galloway made a pie every other day while you were gone, Pa," Sarah informed her father. "But none as big as this one." Hugh's eyes met Lucy's across the table, a silent exchange that sent warmth spreading through her chest. "She's been taking good care of you then." "The best care," James confirmed, his earlier reserve toward Lucy notably absent. "And she stood up to that mean Mr. Johnson too. Rusty says she's braver than most men he knows." Lucy felt her cheeks flush as all eyes turned to her. "I simply did what needed doing," she said, busying herself with serving pie to hide her embarrassment, "and more besides," Hugh said quietly. "Much more." The drovers departed after dinner, tipping their hats to Lucy and thanking Hugh for the good wages and fine meal. The children, despite their excitement, were drooping with exhaustion, and Lucy supervised their bedtime routine while Hugh settled accounts with his men. When she emerged from tucking in Thomas, who had fallen asleep mid-story, she found James waiting in the hallway, clutching a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I almost forgot," he said, holding it out to her. "Your present from Fort Worth, like I promised." Lucy took the package, touched by the boy's remembrance. "Thank you, James, that was very thoughtful of you." "Open it now," he urged, watching her expectantly. Lucy carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a small wooden box intricately carved with a pattern of Texas wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the delicate craftsmanship. "It's for your sewing things," James explained. "Pa helped me pick it out, said you'd like the flowers because they remind you of home." Lucy's eyes stung with sudden tears. He was right. "It's perfect, James." "Thank you," the boy nodded, suddenly shy again. "Good night, Miss Galloway." "Good night, James." She watched him go to his room, marveling at the change in him not just from the cattle drive experience but in his attitude toward her. The reserve he'd maintained for months had melted away, replaced by a cautious acceptance that felt like a precious gift. Lucy placed the box on the small table in the sitting room and moved to the kitchen to begin cleaning up from the evening meal. She had just finished washing the last plate when Hugh appeared in the doorway, his damp hair indicating he'd taken advantage of the hot water she'd prepared earlier. "You should be resting," she said, echoing words they'd exchanged many times before. "You've had a long journey." "Too restless for sleep," he replied, entering the kitchen. "Let me help with that." Before she could protest, he'd taken up a dish towel and begun drying the clean plates she'd stacked by the sink. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the domesticity of the scene striking Lucy with its rightness. "James gave me the box," she said finally. "It's lovely." Hugh smiled. He picked it out himself, spent half his earnings from the drive on it. This revelation made the gift even more precious. "I'm honored, and a bit surprised given how he felt about me before you left." "Children sense things," Hugh said, setting down a dried plate. "They know when something or someone is good for them, even if they resist at first." He paused, then added quietly, "just like their father." Lucy's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Hugh, let's sit," he suggested, gesturing toward the porch. "It's cooler outside, and I'd like to talk to you properly." Lucy dried her hands and followed him out onto the porch, where the evening breeze offered relief from the lingering heat of the day. They settled on the swing, not quite touching but close enough that Lucy could feel the warmth of him beside her. For a long moment neither spoke, the gentle creak of the swing and the chorus of night insects filling the silence. Finally, Hugh cleared his throat. "Johnson came to see me this afternoon, before I got home." This wasn't what Lucy had expected him to say. What did he want? "To reiterate his offer for the ranch, and to warn me about the dangers of keeping unsuitable influences around my children." Hugh's voice hardened on the last words. Lucy's stomach clenched. "He meant me," Hugh nodded. "Said a respectable widower should be more careful about the company he keeps, especially a woman who'd challenge a man like him so boldly." "I'm sorry if I've caused trouble." "Don't," Hugh interrupted firmly. "Don't apologize for protecting my family when I couldn't. For standing up to a bully who thought he could intimidate a woman alone." The vehemence in his voice surprised her. "What did you tell him?" Hugh turned to face her, his expression intense in the dim light from the house windows. "I told him that the Langston ranch isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. That the cattle drive was successful enough to pay off our debts and see us through the winter, and that if he ever threatened my family again, including you, he'd answer to me personally." "Including me," Lucy repeated softly. Hugh reached for her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. "Lucy, these past months, you've become more than an employee, more than a friend even. You're part of this family now. The children see it. I see it." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "The question is, do you want that? Do you want to stay not as our housekeeper, but as—" "As what, Hugh?" Lucy whispered, her heart thundering in her chest. "As my wife," he said simply. "As a mother to these children who already love you, as my partner in everything this ranch, this life." Joy and disbelief warred within her. "Hugh, are you certain? It hasn't been that long since Margaret—" "I loved my wife," Hugh said quietly. "Part of me always will, but Margaret is gone and she wouldn't want me or the children to spend our lives in mourning. She'd want us to find happiness again." He squeezed Lucy's hand. And you, Lucy Galloway, make us happy. You make me happy in a way I never thought I'd feel again. Tears welled in Lucy's eyes. The children, what will they think? Hugh's smile was tender. Sarah already asked me if you could be their new mother. Thomas took it as a given that you'd stay forever. And James, well, he suggested I'd better ask you properly before someone else recognized what a treasure you are. Lucy laughed through her tears. Wise beyond his years, that one, indeed. Hugh reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that gleamed in the moonlight, a simple gold ring with a modest pearl at its center. I bought this in Fort Worth. Been carrying it the whole way home, practicing what I'd say. Lucy stared at the ring, speechless. I'm not a man of flowery words, Hugh continued, but I know what I feel. I love you, Lucy, and I want to build a life with you here on this land with these children, if you'll have me. Lucy looked from the ring to Hugh's face, seeing in his eyes the same hope that had sustained her through the uncertain weeks of his absence. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, Hugh Langston, I'll have you, all of you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise rather than a passion. But as Lucy leaned into him, her hands finding their way to his shoulders, the kiss deepened into something more profound. A homecoming. A beginning. When they finally parted, Hugh rested his forehead against hers. I should have done that months ago, Lucy smiled. We weren't ready months ago. And now, she said, I can't imagine being anywhere but here with you and the children. This is home, Hugh, you are home. They remained on the porch swing until the moon rose high above the Texas landscape, talking of the future they would build together, the challenges they would face, the joys they would share. And when they finally went inside, hand in hand, Lucy knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found where she belonged. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, a simple ceremony in the San Pedro church, attended by neighbors and friends who had watched the romance blossom between the widowed rancher and the determined woman who had come to care for his children. Sarah served as flower girl, strewing wildflower petals along the aisle with solemn purpose. James stood proudly beside his father, the ring-bearer's responsibility weighing heavily on his young shoulders. And Thomas, too young for an official role but unwilling to be left out, appointed himself happiness guardian, a title of his own invention that involved beaming at everyone from his seat in the front pew. Rusty gave Lucy away, the old cowboy looking unrecognizable in his Sunday best, his weathered face creased with emotion as he placed her hand in Hugh's. The preacher spoke of new beginnings and second chances, of love that grows from respect and shared purpose. And when Hugh and Lucy exchanged their vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the church, including, to everyone's surprise, Randall Johnson's, who had arrived uninvited but had been permitted to stay as a gesture of reconciliation. The celebration afterward, held at the Langston Ranch under a canopy of autumn leaves, lasted well into the evening. Neighbors brought food and drink, musicians played lively tunes, and children darted between the adults in games of tag that grew increasingly exuberant as the night progressed. Lucy found a quiet moment amid the festivities to stand on the porch, surveying what was now officially her home. The barn had been rebuilt, sturdier than before. The creek flowed clear and strong along the property's edge. And everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of the life she and Hugh were building together, the vegetable garden she'd expanded, the fresh paint on the house trim, the new swing set Hugh had constructed for the children. Happy Mrs. Langston. Hugh's voice came from behind her, followed by his arms encircling her waist. Lucy leaned back against him, savoring the sound of her new name. More than I ever thought possible, he pressed a kiss to her temple. The children are asking for you. Something about cutting the cake before Thomas takes matters into his own hands. Lucy laughed. We'd better hurry then. That boy has a determined streak. Wonder where he gets that from, Hugh mused, his eyes twinkling as he glanced meaningfully at his new wife. Hand in hand, they returned to the celebration, to the family that had found its way to completeness through loss and love and courage. And later that night, when the guests had departed and the children were tucked into their beds, Lucy and Hugh stood on the porch once more, watching stars appear in the vast Texas sky. Thank you, Hugh said softly, "for answering that advertisement. For staying when it would have been easier to leave. For loving these children and me when we needed it most." Lucy turned in his arms, reaching up to trace the lines of his face lines that had softened in recent weeks as joy gradually replaced grief. "Thank you for making room in your heart for me, for trusting me with your family, for giving me a home." Their kiss beneath the stars sealed promises that extended far beyond the vows they'd exchanged, that day promises of partnership through whatever challenges lay ahead, of family bonds strengthened by choice rather than merely blood, of love that had emerged from unlikely circumstances to become the foundation of their shared future. And the next evening, as had become their ritual, the Langston family gathered around the table that Hugh had built. James, Sarah, and Thomas waited with growing patience as Lucy set down the supper. She'd prepared a hearty stew with fresh baked bread. Simple fare made special by the love that infused every aspect of their home. "Eat before it cools," she said, taking her seat beside Hugh, her hand finding his beneath the table. And as their children reached for their spoons, Hugh and Lucy exchanged a glance that contained all the words they didn't need to say: gratitude for the journey that had brought them together, contentment in the present moment, and hope for all the days to come in the life they were building, one meal, one moment, one memory at a time.